Welcome back to another episode of Pen to Pod. I can't believe we're already on episode 5 of this podcast. I've been working on this for so long, but just already being at 5 feels a little monumental. So thank you to everyone who has been listening and watching and sharing this podcast with other writers. Today's episode, I'm talking to Rachel Kitch. Rachel Kitch is a horror author. She's a mixed-race Thai-American writer with a love of writing unsettling, creepy books that still have a spark of light. Rachel has her master's in design from the University of Pennsylvania and a bachelor's from West Virginia University. As a Generation 1.5 immigrant, Rachel loves to blend her heritage and incorporate Thai and Appalachian folklore into her projects. She's currently represented by Rose Farrow of PS Literary Agency. Talking with Rachel was really amazing. Me and her both love to yap, so we had really great conversations about so many different topics. I really also just wanted to let Rachel speak in this episode. Every time she gave an answer, I just was in awe of her mind. I just think the way that she thinks and articulates her writing process and her inspiration and background is truly beautiful and inspiring for anyone. There's so much that we talk about. We talk about biracial identity and her experiences of straddling two cultures that really inspired Rachel to write the stories she writes today. We talk a lot about the common themes in Southeast Asian and Appalachian stories, as well as discussing this new era of horror. So how not all horror stories have to be about scaring the reader, that they really can be about unsettling and thought-provoking themes that make us question why things are uncomfortable. She talks about the struggle of being a people pleaser and how she wrote that into her current book, The Forest Bleeds. We talk about world building in a locked room setting, science and magic, exploring the dynamics of obsession, power, and sexuality, all on top of her querying process and advice for other writers. There is so much packed in here. I really couldn't cut anything out, which is why this is a bit more of a longer episode today. Rachel Kitch has a story coming soon, so if you don't follow her, make sure to follow at Rachel Kitch. All of the information will be in the description for this episode so that you don't miss an announcement on when we can get or when we can expect this story to come out. But the story that we talk about today is The Forest Bleeds. And this story is about Sage Chambers, who is constantly anxious and chronically overprepared. Relatable. And from determining the best application of her blood witch magic in her bioengineering PhD to figuring out how to fit in with her cohort, she's desperate to find structure in a life full of open-ended questions. So when Sage and her fellow doctoral candidates depart for a conference, she has planned and anticipated every last detail. But she's not prepared for the moment their bus turns off the highway and takes them into a remote mansion in the Appalachian Mountains, the gate sealing shut behind them. The mansion's owner, Arias Medea, issues a simple mandate: fix his injured leg or die. But it's no ordinary injury. The flesh melts off the bone, emitting waves of foul magic that set Sage's blood alight. This story has, and you'll hear Rachel talk about it, but it has so much more than all the amazing things you just heard, right? It is a locked room horror with magic and science and dark academia vibes, but it also tells something deeper. And I'll let Rachel talk about that. You said you got your hair blown out yesterday for your author photos?
I did.
love that. That's amazing. That's so much fun. How'd they go?
It was, oh my God, so much better than anticipated. And it was one of those things where I thought I wanted something very specific. And then she was doing the photos exactly how I thought. And I was like, oh, they don't look great. And then she was like, I've got this old antique couch with a tarp over it. Do you want to take photos with it? And then it was like my perfect creepy horror author's like dream. And so she got some beautiful
Amazing.
shots with it. So turned out
Oh
better
my
than I
gosh, that
hoped.
is so fun. I love it. Well, since you got your author photos done yesterday, I guess I'll open it actually asking, where are you in the publishing process right now?
So I am in the part of the process where I'm sitting on a lot of secrets and I can't actually say anything yet, which is super, super exciting, but also driving me up the wall because all I want to do is scream about my news and I can't say anything yet. But I'm hoping in the next couple of months, I have some very exciting things to share.
That is probably, yeah, exciting and horrifying. I'm like not the best secret keeper when it's like exciting news. So I can only imagine. I can only imagine. Let's go back to the beginning then. I always like asking, when did you first know you wanted to write, or have you always identified kind of as a writer?
Yeah, so writing is actually really, really new to me. Um, when I was growing up, I was a big reader, but I was actually a competitive acrobat. So that took up like all of my time and energy up until like my retirement at the end of high school. And by that time, I had a lot of friends who knew that they were going to be writers, like capital W, capital A author. And I was like, oh, I'm just like not one of those people. So it just never like occurred to me that I could even really try, especially a little bit like quote unquote later in life, even though I was only like 18 or something. And then I went to college, got into like a really big reading slump, worked a super demanding corporate consulting job, and kind of lost myself creatively for a really long time until I went back to grad school for design. And that's when kind of like that creative part of my brain like opened up again. And then I got back into reading in like a really intense way. I think a couple years ago, I read like 600 fantasy books in 1 year. Um, and they were all in, yeah, they were all like indie published, like self-published books, and they were all so good. And I was like, wait, I actually have always wanted to kind of do this. And I had this like epic fantasy idea that had been like in the like nestled in the back of my brain because so I'm half Thai and half white. And there's always like you don't quite ever feel at home in either side of your culture. So you're always like straddling two worlds. And I really wanted to see a fantasy story out there that explored that more as like that allegory of being biracial. And even after reading 600 fantasy books in 1 year, I didn't really get that feeling. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to try writing it myself. Um, and so in the end of 2022, I ended up writing my very first book in probably like the span of 3 or 4 months. And that kind of like unleashed the floodgates on everything. And then I kept writing ever since. So it's only been like 2 years since I've been writing.
Okay, this is amazing and so much to unpack. First, acrobatics. We got to start there. How did you get into acrobatics, and what were you doing in acrobatics? I love it.
So it's a weird sport. So when you think of like acrobatics or gymnastics, people either think of like the circus and like trapeze and everything, or they think of like regular gymnastics where you've got like the bars, beam, vault, and floor that you see in like the Olympics and Simone Biles killing it as always. Um, Acrobatic gymnastics is kind of like one of the weird children disciplines of the gymnastics umbrella. So we were recognized by USA Gymnastics, and you get the same treatment and structure and programs and everything. We're just a lot less like visible and I guess well funded. But it was funny because it just so happened that when we moved to the States, we were 10 minutes away from the best acrobatic gymnastics gym on the East Coast. So I
Oh.
was always doing flips and everything around the house. And my parents were like, you're going to break some furniture. Let's put you in classes. And it was just a total coincidence that they put me in like an acro gym. And when I started doing classes, they scouted me and like recruited me for their like competitive program. So I competed as an acrobat for maybe like 12 years or so. A little bit less than that actually. But basically it's, you're doing only floor, but you've got partners and you're essentially doing flips off of your partners. So I was in a trio, which is like 3 people, and then a women's pair, which is 2 women. Also mixed pairs, which is like a man and a woman. And I was on the US national team for a long time, and I competed at the 2010 World Championships for on behalf of the US.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing. You said that you retired end of high school, but this was like a really large chunk of your life. Do you feel like you learned anything from acrobatics that you take with you now into this phase of your life?
Yes, I'm actually one of the books that I've been working on is dealing with a lot of the trauma that came from it. This is like
Mm,
my personal opinion on how to raise a child, but it's really tough putting like a young, especially a girl, in a sport where you're literally being judged and you're getting a score on everything that you're doing, as opposed to like a more teamwork based sport where it's like very objective. Like one team scored 3 goals, the other scored 2 goals, that's it. But when it comes down to like the judges like the look of this trio better than yours,
mm.
and that's why they won. It's definitely pretty rough on everything. And I don't know how much you know about like the USA Gymnastics scandals with the Caroli training camp.
Mm,
I trained there, not with
mm.
like Larry Nasser and everything, but it wasn't a great environment, especially for like younger children. So I think I learned a lot about what I don't want to do to future
Yeah.
children, and just a lot about like control and autonomy and like never feeling like you're good enough. And those themes I definitely carry with in every single piece of writing that I do.
Yeah, I think that's like one of my most favorite things about writing is so much of ourselves, either consciously or subconsciously, show up in the writing where we are kind of working through past traumas or trying to understand a part of society that we never really could wrap our head around. So that's really interesting that that's, themes you've already noticed in your life that you're carrying over into your writing.
Yeah, it's like I have always been a people pleaser, and that is like one of the biggest themes that I tackle in my work. And I think when you're literally like
Mhm.
training to please your coach and the judges as much as you can, you're just being like primed to be like the perfect little people pleaser. And so I love trying to take that and then seeing all the different ways that you can go with a character like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. I guess we'll pivot a little bit because you now are talking about acrobatics have kind of shaped you and your writing, and you talked about being half Thai and half white. And I know in your bio, you also talked about, going to school in West Virginia and the Appalachian region. So there's all these identities that you are carrying. How do you feel like that is playing a role in your writing then?
I think it's one of the biggest drivers in my writing. What has been really fascinating is the amount of like history and folklore that comes out of both like the Southeast Asian region, but also the Appalachian Mountains, because you have so many hundreds of years of everything and so many strong people, like just the grit and determination and like suffering that so many of these like populations have been through. It gives a really like strong well of things to draw on, but also just like the unique, like specific folklore stories that you don't really see in traditional media very often. I'm loving this new rise of like Appalachian stories that I'm seeing, but I still think there can be more. And then Southeast Asian stories have been really underrepresented, but it's really interesting because they're literally on opposite sides of the world, but there's so many common themes that both have in their histories and traditions. Like both the Appalachian Mountains and in Thailand, there's stories about seeing floating red eyes at night in the woods. Like super creepy. They completely represent like different stories, but like a very common thing. And as a horror author, that's like a really easy thing to draw on. Like, oh yeah, that's freaky. Like let's like unpack that a little bit. Um, but there's also so many like similar messages and themes in these like folk tales that people are telling, which is really like respect the land, like stay out of what is not yours to begin with, which I think are great messages to tell, but they have like so many common themes that it's a lot easier than anticipated to like weave everything together and like create a cohesive narrative even though I'm drawing on things literally from like a world away from each other.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And like you said, the folklore might not be as represented in like mainstream media. So where were you like turning to research this folklore and figure out these stories for yourself and then for your work also?
It was a lot of like academic research papers and like history books that I was trying to find these like stories in. Especially because like growing up, I wasn't really hearing these stories from my mom. She was very much determined to have me be like a perfect all-American daughter because as an immigrant, like you want your kid to assimilate. But then the problem is like I lost a lot of that connection to like my Thai heritage as a result. So doing the research for my book also let me like learn more about this history that I just never heard about before. Um, but I ended up approaching it kind of like an academic exercise where I'm just trying to gather all of the facts. And then once I understood kind of like what I was working with, that was when the story really started to take shape and like understanding what I could draw out of it versus like where my creativity like comes into play.
And with academics, you said, so you got your bachelor's at WVU. So going from marketing to then master's in design, and you said that you're working the corporate life, which I totally relate to. Been there. Did that awakening kind of happen or feel like when you got your creativity back, when you were doing your master's? And you said it kind of like awakened that creative side of you. Like, was there like a specific moment that happened? Or was it just kind of like a natural progression because you were just in a lot of creativity?
I think it was definitely like a more natural progression. I've always been like a more creative person, but being able to like actually take the time, I think was like the most important part, like really carving out the ability to say, I'm going to create something just because. Um, that was really the first step in everything. And just being able to like experiment and not having to be under a crazy deadline or like something that I just didn't care about. And so I could finally start making things like for me and not for anybody else. That was really when, like, I guess like the synapses started like firing again, where it was like, oh, not only like do I care about what I'm making, but I'm a lot more connected to like the reason why I'm making it. And I can like just put so much more of myself into the process as well as the outcome. Um, I think in like corporate America, everything is so outcome driven that being able to take the time and like go back to the process and like learning how to enjoy the just like the feeling of making something again was kind of like a game changer for me.
Yeah, I love that. Like enjoying the ride of the process, I think is so important because, as writers, we joke. We're like, we hate writing books. Blah, it's so hard. But like the majority of writing is the process. Like we spend so much time drafting and revising and all of that before we actually get that outcome. So you do have to kind of find joy along the way. And with that, then, like, have you found a writing process or are you still kind of finding it?
Definitely my process is like a little bit on the weirder end of the spectrum, because so many people are very good at the like, first draft is your vomit draft, like get the words on the page, like don't edit while you go. It's funny. So I have another writing friend and we joke that we're on the opposite sides of the spectrum where I don't know if you've ever seen that TikTok sound, but it's like, I can thrive under any conditions. And then I'm allergic to tap water on the other side. Um, but I'm
Yeah.
definitely on the like, I'm allergic to tap water side. Um, I am an early morning writer. So the first thing I do is wake up. I go to work a couple hours beforehand and then I sit in a coffee shop by my office. And then I carve out like an hour to two a day of just writing. And some days I write 0 words. Sometimes I get a lot done, but unless I can like feel the words inside of my brain before I start, that's the only way I'm getting anything down on the page. But as a result, a lot of like my first draft makes it into the final draft. So I just have to be very confident in knowing like what I have to say before I get it down on paper. Which sometimes means like my drafts come slower, but sometimes like I know exactly what to say. And so they just come out. So I'm definitely like figuring out what to do in times of like drought or like I don't feel confident in the story. But I've kind of like learned like in order to write a book, I have to know what I want to say. And if I don't know that yet, then I should not be drafting.
That's so, I like how you said I have to like feel the words before I put it on paper. Is there even a process for that? Or are you someone who, I'm imagining you like daydreaming in the shower, like before you go to bed, you're thinking about your story, like, you know, in those little moments throughout the day, and then you can put it down on paper? Or is there like another way you kind of have to feel the words?
There's a lot of that where like randomly I'll be like hit with like a bit of inspiration and I'm like jotting down like either plot notes or like sometimes the actual like words that like end up in the draft. I'll like draft like small scenes on like my notes app and things, but it's really kind of like I have to just be so fully immersed in everything before everything starts to like take shape. But as a result, like my plotting versus like pantsing method is like a little bit interesting because I do a little bit of like a combination where I draft in these like I call them little like vignettes where I don't write in order whatsoever, which kind of makes it a nightmare in terms of like, oh my God, I have like 50,000 words written, but you can only read 3 chapters. Like what's going on there? But I will always like write a couple vignettes of the book before I can like really feel it. So I'm like getting like the flavor of the prose and like the flavor of the characters and like, I guess like the rhythm and the beats of the story. And then I go and like fully outline the book. But it's not until I have like, this sounds really weird, but like the taste of like the character and everything, that I start feeling like confident in the story and like can go from there.
Loving these descriptor words, the taste of the characters. I understand what you mean though. Like you have to like, it's the theme, it's the setting, it's, you know, all of that. And I feel like being a horror writer too, like setting and the feel of a story is very important because you have to get across a lot of those vibes, I guess, as we all say now, into the story for everybody. And with horror, you said you read 600 fantasy books in 1 year, which is incredible. So you read a lot of fantasy. How did horror writing kind of come about?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because I had definitely read some horror, but never really clicked with it as a genre. But then I read Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And I don't know, have you read it?
Yeah.
An amazing book. And I think what really clicked with that book and for the genre with me was I learned that horror doesn't have to be about scaring somebody. Like that was the like preconceived notion I had of the genre before like getting to explore it a little bit more. I thought it was all about jump scares, like slasher, like you're trying to scare somebody. And my writing is not really, I guess, like scary. There's a lot of like tension, but I try to go more for like the unsettling things. And what I always try to do with like horror writing is understand like why something is so unsettling to you. And what I love so much about Mexican Gothic is it was unsettling because of all the history that was there with colonialism, colorism, like imperialism, like the war that was going on in that time frame, and just like the unbalanced power dynamic between like a white man and a woman of color. And that was the first time I had really read something where BIPOC voices were so centered and used as like an avenue of horror, but like in a really meaningful way. There's a lot of commercial horror that I really admire and respect, but sometimes it feels like the scare is there for more like shock value or they're doing it to scare you. Whereas this like new era of horror, I think that's been coming to light in the last couple of years. It's about why is this scary? Like what about our society is making you feel uncomfortable in this moment? And it was that like really like clicked in my head. And that is what I wanted to say and write about rather than just make you scared to be scared. I want the audience to understand, like, why is this so uncomfortable? Like, what about the power dynamics? Like, what generational trauma is coming to light? And that is where like I started getting more into like the horror genre.
Yeah, I really like that. And I loved Mexican Gothic, and so I can see what you mean. Like, it's not scaring for scaring's sake. It is pointing a mirror, like you said, like back at society and why are these things so scary? Why is this so unsettling? It reminds me of, oh my gosh, what is the popular Netflix science fiction show that now it makes me hate technology?
Black Mirror.
Yes, Black Mirror. What you were talking about reminds me of Black Mirror, because that's kind of what they do too in a science fiction way. Everything is so scary and unsettling because it's showing what flaws we have as a society right now, or, you know, the scary implications that technology could have. That's a really interesting way to look at horror. I really like that. And you also have a number of short publications, and some of them are horror as well. So when did you start writing short fiction then, and kind of your journey into writing?
Yeah, so I started writing, I mean, short fiction is really, really recent. I started writing short stories in 2023. So I think I had actually finished my second book, The Forest Bleeds, by the time I started writing short fiction. And it came because like I had so many ideas, but by that point I knew how much work it is and how much needs to go into like a full length novel. And I would get inspired by certain things happening in the news or in my life. And I would get these little like seeds of ideas. But I knew like they wouldn't work for like a full length novel, or I just wasn't inspired enough by them at the time to turn them into a full length novel. So I think my first ever short story that I wrote is called The Earth's Teeth. And it was inspired by a string of climate related headlines that I was seeing, where I think it was like this crazy hurricane had just hit Mexico, global warming on the rise. Like I just opened the news every single day for like a week, and it was like everybody is going to die, like climate change is real, like the earth is in shambles. But then I would like close the tab and then have to go to the stupid little corporate meeting where it was like there was just such a cognitive disconnect there where I was like, this doesn't matter, but everyone is like acting like they're actually going to die in this corporate meeting where nobody's going to die, everything's going to be fine, but like the earth is literally on fire. And that was the entire like premise of the short story. It's about a corporate worker who is essentially, she's being counted down to the days until the earth's teeth are going to bite down. And the earth's teeth had bitten down in other places and like wiped countries off the map and all these things. But these people are like in their offices and they're like, oh, it won't happen to us, so we'll be fine. So it's like she's getting a literal countdown of like the days until they're going to essentially be wiped off the planet. But she's more worried about her presentation. So it was like a very like dystopian, like satirical piece, because I was like, I just cannot wrap my head around worrying about all these things when we have such bigger things to worry about. And that was the first like short story I had written. And so I tried to figure out these like little seeds of like inspiration and work them into like smaller pieces like when I can, because otherwise I will like go feral and start running in the woods at how crazy some of this stuff and we see in reality is.
Yeah. I read that short piece as well as a couple of your other ones, and I resonated with that again as someone who worked a corporate job where everyone acts like everything is the end of the world, and you have to just like smile on a Zoom meeting when you just heard like the worst thing ever on the news like 10 minutes ago. So yeah, I really resonated with that piece. And you kind of mentioned it before. It's like you really are writing to understand the things like you're like trying to wrap your head around, which I think is such a beautiful way to write, and why writing is still so powerful. And I don't think will ever not be powerful, because it's just a lot of people trying to write what they don't understand or want other people to understand. But with your short stories, you had this one, The Earth's Teeth. Then you also had one that like actually really creeped me out about people's flat teeth. So much so, like I thought about it all day after reading it. And that's why I have to ask, like, what is so scary about teeth? Like, is teeth a big theme? Are you scared of teeth? Or are they an analogy for something? Now I'm scared of very flat teeth, personally.
This is so fun. Like all of my critique partners are always roasting me for being obsessed with teeth. I don't fully know where it came from, but to me, there's something just like deeply unsettling about teeth. I mean, if you think about it, they're literally bones that you can see and touch all the time. There's also like a weird
Yeah.
permanent impermanence feeling to teeth because it's like I'm very scared of the dentist also. I think a lot of people are scared of the dentist. There's something really vulnerable about like laying down and opening your mouth really wide and a masked man is like shoving his fist in your mouth. Creepy, really weird. Um, but what I've always like found fascinating is like in times of stress, I always get that dream that all of my teeth are falling out to the point where I'm just like constantly scared I'm gonna lose all of my teeth. And it turns out it's like a really common anxiety where it's like it symbolizes like a loss of like feeling of control in your life. Like when you're really anxious about everything that's going on, you have the dream about losing all of your teeth, um, which I just think is like a really interesting analogy. And again, there's something so vulnerable about teeth. Um, and it's like I grind my teeth like no other. So that short story, like Flat Teeth, is like kind of inspired by me grinding my teeth all the time. And like dentists will look at my teeth and be like, "Oh, you're really stressed as a person." And I'm like, "I don't like that you know that just by looking at my teeth." Um, something there's like it's very vulnerable. I like still don't fully understand it, but I think I write weird teeth in like most of my books now.
I think you've forever changed my view on teeth, even just by saying the permanence of it. Like that blew my mind. But I agree with you. I hate the dentist. I actually recently just had to go last week and it was horrible. Horrible. But I get that. There is something scary about teeth. And hey, it's nothing's wrong with that. I feel like as a horror author, you kind of need like a signature thing, you know? Like a signature motif that appears in every book. I feel like that's very, reminiscent of a lot of horror authors. So I love it. And now you've made me scared of teeth. So
I'm both sorry, but also not. Like I'm glad that I can leave that imprint. But it's like my I guess like horror signature has always been around body horror. Because to me, there's like nothing scarier than like losing control of your own body. Because like out of everything in the world, your body is the only constant that you have. So being in a situation where gross things are happening or you're not in control of your own body or things are happening that you don't understand and you have to like deal with it all the time. That is like one of the worst things that I can imagine.
have you read Shark Heart, that book?
No, I haven't.
We'll have to remember who wrote it. I just read it this year and it was so interesting. It is about a husband and a wife, and the husband is turning into a shark, like a great white shark, like very horribly. Like it's like all body horror. It's so unsettling. It is so good. Highly recommend if you like that kind of stuff. And it's like, symbolizes so many other things, but it was interesting and horrifying to read as well.
Yeah, I definitely have to read that. One of my favorite reads recently has been Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, where it's a
Mm-hmm.
similar story and just like the slow transformation into something that nobody is understanding. Love that trope. Love exploring that. That's one of the tropes that I have pulled into my own work in The Forest Bleeds as well, where one of the characters starts mutating into a creature that nobody understands. and they don't know what's going wrong with him. And he's like slowly losing his mind. His skin begins falling off. He's like doesn't know where he is. He's like screaming and screaming and screaming. One of the like most unsettling things I can think of is just like these horrific body horror transformations, and I love it every single time.
And so in The Forest Bleeds Teeth, you have this very rich man who is enlisting these students for help, and he's losing control over his body. Where was the inspiration for this story? How did you come up with this? It's such a fascinating premise.
Yeah, so it really stems again from like the concept of being a people pleaser. Because I am the biggest people pleaser. It's why in corporate America, I did very well. I was very good at my job, but I completely lost myself in the process. Because when you're just saying yes, 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 over and over again, you're losing any sense of like your own boundaries. And I read so many fantasy books and also grew up reading so many fantasy books where the heroine is this feisty, powerful, sword swinging person. And I love reading about them so much, but it was hard for me to imagine myself in those situations. Not saying that I'm one of those people who has to like self-insert in every story, because I'm like, yes, queen, like please do it, because I cannot. But I also wanted to explore what a terrible situation would be for somebody who just didn't have that part of like a personality to them. And so many like locked room thrillers too, where people are like given rules, they're like, F you, like I'm gonna fight back. If somebody puts a gun to my head and is like, do this, I'd be like, yeah, you got it. Like, no problem. I'm on it. So,
Yeah.
so I was really thinking like, as a people pleaser, like what is the worst possible situation that I could be in? And it would be something where I would have to fight against my natural urge to say yes. Like, what situation would have to arise? Like, what other character ties would I have to have in order to say no? Which has been something that's so much harder for me to say than to say yes. So that's really where like the premise came into play, where it was like, what would happen if like a character whose instinct was to say yes would have to think about saying no? And that's where all the like push and pull dynamics come in. So they're kidnapped by Arias Medea, who is this evil pharmaceutical billionaire with a disgusting rotting leg. But he's also embodying a lot of the things that Sage, the main character, wants, which is a feeling of control and security. Because he's saying, I will give you a schedule. I will take care of you. You do not have to worry about all of these other things. Like, I will create this perfect environment for you to be in. And it's really, really tempting. And so a lot of the book is her trying to figure out, like, he's this horrible person, but he's giving me all of these things that I've always wanted. So how do I fight against all of these, like, instincts that I have? And at what point do I also stop trying to martyr myself and put myself on the line because I care about all these other people as well?
That is so, I love that. I just love how you're like kind of depicting Sage, the main character. And you said, I don't always have to self-insert, but I kind of love it when authors self-insert in a main character, because I feel like they really, come alive. And like you said, like this started the whole premise for the story of like, what horrible situation would I be in if I couldn't say no? And I like that you also talked about all the fantasy, badass women characters that we see. I love reading them too. But I agree. I read them sometimes. I'm like, I would never say that in this situation. I would probably apologize. I probably wouldn't yell back at this man who's yelling at me. I'd be like, wow, I'm so sorry. Never speak to me again. You're right. I did a horrible thing. So I love that you're kind of giving us people pleasers, someone to root for, and still be a strong female character, which is a really cool concept to kind of unpack.
Yeah. What I really wanted to do with Sage too is like show, like, sometimes saying, like, going along with things, it might seem like on the surface to be like the easier decision, but sometimes it's not. And sometimes like gritting your teeth and going along with it costs so much more than simply like fighting back on the surface. And it's a different type of strength, and it's just a different emotional journey and character arc. And just also being able to relate to somebody, because I'm like, oh, I could not fight my way out of this castle. I have to turn the music off to parallel park. Like that's just not me.
Yeah, I feel that. Um, I also have to turn the music off. I have to turn the music off if I don't know where I am and I need to like
Yeah.
reorient myself. The music has to be turned
If
off
somebody
a lot
tries to
for me to think.
if somebody tries to speak to me, I'm like, do not look at me, do not acknowledge me. Like, if you're a passenger in my car, like, sit down and shut up and let me process.
Right. So how am I supposed to fight a battle and like take over a castle if I can't drive without someone speaking to me?
Exactly.
And so with The Forest Bleeds, reading about it and watching you post about it on Instagram, and I'm so excited for your story, by the way, but it has magic elements that I found really interesting, mixed with all these real world elements, which is personally one of my favorite things people can do in books. But it has that touch of like science and horror. So there's a lot going on. So how did you come to the conclusion to have magic in this story? And did you have to build a magic system? Like, what was writing that like?
Yeah. So this is like my weird, I guess, soapboxy take on life, but there are so many things that I don't understand and don't comprehend that people can do that to me, it feels like magic. Like seeing Simone Biles compete a Yurchenko double pike in the Olympics when nobody really thought that that was possible, that she has like a certain magic to herself. Um, and whenever I see like scientific advancements and like the culmination of dozens of years of research and everything, to me, that is another form of magic. It's just something that I could never begin to hope to understand. And it feels like they like snapped their fingers and it came into existence. But I think it really does track with like traditional fantasy because you always have the training montage where somebody doesn't understand their powers and has to get better at it. And they have to study and train and all of these things. And to me, that felt kind of like academia, where you're able to do these crazy things that nobody really cares or knows about, but you've gone through all of these years of like research and study and training to be able to do it. So really integrating magic just kind of let me push the boundaries of a lot of science that I was seeing. My master's degree in design, I actually specialized in health, like designing for healthcare. Because to me, that is like the pinnacle of being able to help somehow. So I've always had this interest in science and biomedical stuff and just learning about like all the different like advancements. And to me, it just seemed like a really natural way of like weaving in a witchcraft and magic system. Because if these like academics are already doing this like crazy magic in their labs, like if magic was real, they'd still be doing roughly the same. I always have this like theory that if magic was real, we would still be studying it and it would just become a different discipline of academia and all these things. Like all the like crazy physics and electrical engineering that goes into like everything that we need to go like talk on this video call, I know nothing about. Yeah. But and so it kind of is like a different form of magic. And it just became like an extra cool avenue to bring in all of like the folklore elements to it too. In Southeast Asia, there's such a focus on the dead and what happens after you die and like respecting spirits and ghosts. And then in Appalachian folklore, there's also such a focus on respecting the earth and like the very tangible tragedies of like people bleeding into the dirt and what happens there and like what's lingering. And so it became this like really interesting amalgamation of like all of my collective interests, but also pulling from religion. So Vaish, who's one of the other main characters, she's a poison witch. And it comes from the tenets of Buddhism, where you have the different poisons of the soul. And so it manifests as like different poisons that she's able to create. And so she uses those poisons to advance her bioengineering work. Because like if you have a certain skill, you bring it to like your passions and like what you want to create and put out into the world. So I, again, really treated the magic system more as like an academic research exercise and like tracing it from the roots in the different folklore systems, but also looking to see how things like migrate over time. So I looked at global immigration patterns over the last 100 years. I looked at the history of coal mines in Appalachia to create like the magic of the mansion that they're kidnapped to. And also looking to see like, if this was real and people are immigrating, it would create new branches of magic and like different powers and like things. So Sage like gets like is a combination of her Appalachian roots as well as her Thai roots and like seeing how those two things could blend together. So I just really like taking things that probably shouldn't be mixed necessarily and seeing like what I can create out of them. But you're right, there is a lot going on in this book. There's like the sci-fi element, there's a horror element, witchcraft. There's also, it's a bit of a thriller too. When I was querying, that was definitely a very common rejection reason. They're like, we don't know what genre this is. While on submission, I got that passed more than a few times where they're like, we don't know what genre this is. It's too hard to market. Even though it's always been like a horror book in my heart. There are so many other elements, but that's also what I like to read. I love books that combine a bunch of different elements together and create this like beautiful new thing. So that has just been like my approach to a magic system. But funny enough, the world building and magic system has always been the edit like note that I've always gotten because it is a locked room setting. So trying to shove all of this world building and history when they literally go to like one place and stay there for the full book it was a challenge.
Yeah, I agree. I also love reading books that mix genres because what is the fun if you can't add in all these amazing elements? I want to touch on the querying process, but you also mentioned something that I had a question about of like, it is a locked room thriller. Like you're in this mansion, it seems like for the majority of the book. So with the world building, like how does that come out? Is it characters talking to each other? Is it interiority from the main character? How like it's such a different way you have to world build instead of just kind of showing it.
Yeah, it was, oh my God, it was definitely a challenge. And still something that even to this day, I'm tweaking and going back and forth on. Because it's also very, I guess, like person by person dependent. Because I had some critique partners who are very big fantasy people. And so they're like, I want to know every single detail. And then I have some people who are on the other side of the spectrum where they're like, oh, it just be like that. Cool. My like approach to a magic system has always been like, I can do what I want. Thanks. It just be like that. Like, don't make me give you a reason for every single choice all the time. So it's been a very thin tightrope I've had to straddle. But I think the world building comes a lot as like, just like stated facts about the world. Where I think in like one of the chapters, they're talking about everybody's thesis, or their dissertation. And you get to see like the different types of witchcraft come into play, even for like the more minor characters where it's like, oh, magically engineered crops. And so I try to like embed those little seeds and then let the reader kind of like extrapolate what the broader world could be like. But it's not like they have like magical technology or anything like that. Like they're using AirPods and like normal things too. So trying to weave as much as that like more background info, as well as like society's broader attitudes towards magic. Because once again, like I kind of think of it as like bioethics a little bit, where you have some people who are really against it and they're like, you're massacring stem cells and babies and everything. But most people just like don't really understand and they don't care that much. And it's just like a natural part of their world where it's like, yeah, why would anybody care what like these doctoral students at West Virginia University are doing? Because like it just in real life, like I could not tell you what they are doing unless you have like a very niche interest in it. So it's more like a broader, ambiguous like apathy, I guess. It's just like an accepted part of the world. And I think there's a line where it's like, we don't keep our work secret, but we're not advertising it either. Because once again, like why would they? I just tried to like normalize the witchcraft as much as I could, which people will still have questions, I'm sure. But it's definitely, it was a struggle. I really shot myself in the foot with like the premise of this book, I feel, because doing it as like a locked room, but also the premise is like every 3 days somebody dies. So I had to be very particular about the timeline and the order of operations. And it turns out I can't do math or count. So I would accidentally write like 4 days had gone by instead of 3. And that would be like a math problem to untangle later. So it was like as many small, meticulous details as I could plant as possible, as opposed to like showcasing what the world was really like.
Yeah, and I like that though. I feel like it's interesting because, publishing is obviously always trying to look at what's marketable and what they can take to market. But I do think that readers are smarter sometimes than publishing gives them credit for. And I like being able to just, accept things the way they are. Like, okay, cool. In this book, in this world, this is how it happens. So I kind of like that you took that approach, obviously adding in more details, when it's needed. But I like when you can just like jump into a book and be like, okay, this is how the world works here. I can accept that. And we kind of move forward. But I think that is such a hard line between any book that you're setting in the real world and you're adding some sort of like fantastical element, whether it's magic or even paranormal. Like there are the curious minds out there. They're like, why is this happening? And you're like, I don't know, because I want it to. Let me be.
I think the book that really was like the biggest influence in how I structured the magic system was Babel by R.F. Kuang. Have you read it?
Yeah, fantastic.
An absolute masterclass in contemporary fantasy, even though it's not contemporary, but like embedding fantasy elements into the real world, where I just really loved her approach and like, no, it's not, it's like technically magic, but it's like a skill that you have to work towards. And you're not like, you're born into the circumstances that let you be good at something, but the magic comes from the pursuit and study of everything. And so every scholar in Babel has their own like abilities per se because of like where they come from, but it's about their own intellect and like pushing it farther. And like the general population like knows of what they're doing, but again, it's like, oh, weird academics in a tower. Like I just care that this bridge works at the moment. Like I don't really care how you do it.
Yeah, that's so true. Babel is, R.F. Huang in general is like a masterclass in writing. She can do no wrong. I will read everything she puts out ever.
I would read her grocery list 100%.
Yes. And so with like The Forest Bleeds, we kind of talked about themes a little bit in the beginning of our conversation, and you kind of went in knowing these things you wanted to explore, it seems like, at the beginning of this premise. How did you weave that in? On my YouTube channel, I get a lot of questions from viewers of like, how do you weave in themes? Like, how are you weaving in something without it being like too on the nose of like, I'm literally listing it out in a sentence of this is what I want you to take away from this book. So how do you feel like you've done that in The Forest Bleeds?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest themes was power and like learning one's own power, but power imbalances as well, but also obsession. So I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but Stage is neurodivergent. what I love the most about her character is I don't think I ever specify like what flavor of neurodivergence she's got. For me, I think that really tracks because so many people know that they think a little bit differently, their brain operates a little bit differently, but they don't have a diagnosis or they're not comfortable with the label. So everyone who's like read Sage, depending on like what like they have or like they identify with, they will choose different labels. So everything from autism to obsessive compulsive disorder. I have OCD, so I think that is what she has, but it's very open to interpretation. But I also wanted to look at like all of the different sides of obsession to them. So she has a lot of habits and rituals that come through. And so I wanted to explore obsession. So you get Sage's take on obsession, where she's really fixated on the time that's going by or the schedule of the day or how many things are like in a setting. But then on the flip side, I wanted to explore like the harsh aspects of obsession. So Arios, the main villain, he's literally obsessed with Sage and he knows every single little detail about her and he knows like all of her favorite foods and what she likes to do when she's stressed and all of these things. And so just like trying to pair these two, I guess, examples of the themes that I'm trying to like portray just to show the dichotomy and the juxtaposition of everything and showing like all of the different flavors of it without saying like obsession can be good, but it's also bad. And more just like showing it via the scenes that I'm crafting, especially like there's a lot of scenes about their very uneven power dynamic, but she's still attracted to it. And just like showcasing it through that way. But even so, I think there are lines where I do think it's really powerful to like sum up what you're saying in like a couple lines for like the very classic like 600 people highlighted here type of like sentences. Like I think one of the final chapters, there's like a line that's like, she had always been taught to be useful, but now she asks like useful to whom? And trying to convey these like big sweeping themes via like all of the scenes that I'm showing, but also the interiority at a couple of like choice moments too.
That's so cool that you have like two sides of the coin of obsession as like a main theme in the book of the good elements and the bad elements, showcasing in two very different people. That's really cool that you did that. Everything you're saying about this book, I'm like, give it to me right now, Rachel. I'm excited to read this. It's like everything I could ask for. I do feel like we're moving into a stage of where writers really are writing exactly what they want versus trying to always chase the market trends. And we're getting just so many different voices now in the pool of writing where there's just so much more richness to the words that are happening, I think, than like ever before. And I'm just so excited. So excited. I do have this Twitter question that I need to ask. On Twitter, you stated, and I loved it, you said, I write speculative horror steeped in horniness and filled with bodies doing things they shouldn't. And so we've kind of talked about that today, where you really like the element of body horror. But is there a romance element?
So first of all, when you sent that question over, I was really confronted with my digital footprint. Where I was like, oh no.
You're welcome.
Oh no.
You are welcome.
So yes, I do love writing horror that's steeped in horniness. There is a romance element to The Forest Bleeds. There's a sapphic academic rivals to lovers subplot. But the horniness element does come from Sage and Arius's dynamic, where I think there's something incredibly sinister where obsession turns sexual, or a sexual exchange like it should be because it's like a sexual desire, but it's not like stemming out of sexual desire. It's coming from like the wanting to hold power over somebody. So it's like this like push and pull with like sexuality and horror that I'm really obsessed with. And I love taking moments that should be really like caring and intimate and flipping them to be really unsettling because of things like shifting power dynamics or like uncomfortable relationships that are being explored. So a lot of my, especially like my future books that I'm working on now, still have this like sexual element, but it's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be really unsettling and like, oh, why? I don't like it. I don't like it. Um, like the book that I'm working on right now is a Garden of Eden horror. It's blending a lot of, it's not taking religion, looking at like a religious take to it. It's saying, okay, the Garden of Eden is actually real. We cultivated it from stem cells and fossils, and we're trying to create like artificial organs from Garden of Eden stem cells. But I'm trying to use like a broader allegory of the original Garden of Eden story as like part of the characters. And one of the crazy things that I always thought of like this creation Genesis story with like Adam and Eve is like Eve is created from Adam's rib bone. So biologically, they're twins and they reproduce and create humanity. So I thought that was like, that's kind of gross, guys. Like, what's up with that? And so in my Garden of Eden horror, there's twins that are essentially the stewards of the garden, and they get like really obsessed with each other. And so then they start pulling the main character in, and then it becomes a question of like, okay, are they actually interested in her as a person, or are they just using her as like a proxy to like be with each other when they actually can't? So really just like uncomfortable questions. And I think using like sexuality as like a vehicle of like pushing that farther, it's such a vulnerable moment for these people. And so when you're at your most vulnerable, the worst things can happen also. So that's always been an avenue I've tried to explore and push.
I'm obsessed, I think, now with everything you write. That sounds absolutely fantastic. It reminds me of the Reese Witherspoon movie, like Cruel Intentions, the 90s movie. Have you watched it?
I have.
Oh my gosh.
That did a lot to me formatively, I think.
I think for a lot of us, it did a lot of things formatively. But that is such an interesting dynamic. And I like that, yeah, like since you are writing these horror stories and you're bringing in the sexuality aspect to it, I think that's really interesting. And it is interesting to explore kind of those uncomfortable questions or those uncomfortable dynamics that can happen. And like you said, you're using a horror lens, which really is just kind of pointing the mirror back at society of like, why is this making us uncomfortable? Maybe because there's power dynamics at play or obsession and, you know, really dangerous things happening. And we need to like think about that. So that's really, really fascinating.
One of the things I also really wanted to like put into my writing is like the very real experiences that women have to go through. There's so many situations that women find themselves in that I really wanted to portray, but also come away with like some spark of light at least. Because like, again, there is such a strength that you have to have in order to go along with something and still be standing at the end of it. Like to survive something, even if on paper you don't think it was like one thing, but it definitely was a different thing in reality. And to keep living and to keep putting one foot after the other in the aftermath of that, again, a completely different type of strength than what we see in a lot of media. So like portraying those experiences too was like really important to me because so many people go through that. And I just wanted to like, almost like not applaud, but like highlight like, yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. Even if you aren't kicking and fighting and screaming in the moment, it's hard to go through.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, like being able to portray these uncomfortable dynamics that happen a lot in everyday life can be helpful to someone who might have gone through something like that. So like in The Forest Bleeds, you could have readers who might have gotten obsessed with someone who was in a power position and maybe they thought their feelings were love and affection, but not realizing that it's actually something a little bit more dangerous. And I think it is important to showcase that. I mean, that's why we have all the, interesting controversy around books like Lolita, like that, those kind of
Hmm.
stories need to be told and showcased and talked about. And yeah, that's really interesting. I like that you're exploring that, especially the strength aspect that you said that isn't shown in a lot of typical media, of the strength that women have to have to survive something like that. And anyone who goes through, experiences in that manner.
Yeah, it's never like fun to read or write really, but I think these are like important things to show, especially within
Mm.
horror, because the darkness of the genre really lends itself to these very powerful conversations. And again, it's all about flipping the mirror and being like, well, why is this uncomfortable? Well, if you lived through it and you didn't like it, then that is a conversation that you need to have.
With the horror genre, like you said, like it allows the darkness to shine through. And I think it gives less room for any ambiguity, where sometimes people do like those maybe toxic relationships, or they like champion them because it's under a fantasy genre. And I'm thinking of like the Darkling from the Shadow and Bone series. There's like a lot of times that might happen, but when you put a horror lens on it, it does make readers go like, oh, okay, wait, no, this this is bad, this is uncomfortable, let's take a minute and think about it.
Arius is someone that you really want to like be attracted to. I almost tried to like bucket the book into thirds, where the first third you're like, "Oh, hold on, like this could be it." And then the alarm bells start ringing, and then by the end it's like, actually no, like this dude's a straight evil
Mm.
villain. Like there's also a much better like romantic option, and like this is how I get through the other side of like this experience and like live and continue to thrive afterwards. But definitely like playing on those original tropes too, of like taking romance elements and twisting them ever so slightly makes them horror very quickly. I love to think of like the billionaire romances where they buy someone a fancy dress for a night out, and like they come home to the apartment, there's like $10,000 gown on their bed, and it's like, I'm taking you out tonight. And they're like, oh, oh this is great, because like they're into the guy. But if you weren't into him, that gets really creepy really fast. And so it's like, it was really fun taking, like, finding those like romance elements and then twisting them to make you feel really uncomfortable in the moment.
Yeah. And with all these elements, like we said, like the Forest Bleeds has so much going on: romance, magic, horror. And you said querying was pretty difficult with that. So I would love to hear your experience with that, because it seemed like a lot of people were answering positively, but they were unsure about how to market it. So then how did you get to finding your agent now?
Yeah. It was definitely a really interesting journey in terms of like, I had a very hooky pitch. I was also coming on the tail end of like the dark academia trend. And then one of like the early adopters, I guess, in like the new horror trend, which was really just luck and timing on my part, because I didn't know that horror would become like a thing by the time I started querying. So I had a lot of agents like express a lot of interest really quickly. But the problem with the Forest Bleeds is sometimes like when I pitch it, people have like a very preconceived notion of like what it's going to be, especially with like the locked room thriller element. Um, but really, it's so much more than just like this death contest that they're being told. And it's so much more than just like, oh, scary monsters in the woods, like who's going to survive? So I had a lot of step asides for like no editorial vision, or they didn't know how to market it, or they just didn't know what genre it fell under. The editorial vision too, it's like one of those rejections that kind of sucks, but I also completely understand, because it is really hard to like read a manuscript and know exactly what to do to like make it better or improve it, or even how to like pitch it correctly. I mean, I was definitely really lucky in my querying process that it went by relatively quickly. I think from like start to end, it was a little over 4 months, from sending my first query to signing with my agent. Um, I'm also a life lesson in all of these like extra things that people try to do while querying. But in the end, it was not necessary and it did not help me. So it's like people see like the Twitter pitch contests or like paying for like agent 101s and like conferences and all these things. I did all of that like extra stuff mainly to pass the time while querying and like make it feel like I was like making progress. But in the end, like none of that actually got me any of my agent offers. It was essentially a cold query. And actually, it's kind of like a funny story because doing all those extra things actually prolonged my querying process probably. So Rose was one of the first queries that I sent. PS Lit has a like 6 weeks, like no response means no policy. And I was really nervous about that. And then one of their other agents, Eric Smith, was taking pitches at a writing conference in like 6 weeks after I had sent that query. So I was like, I'll just pitch him because then at least I know like I'll get like rejected to my face and it's just not like a no response query. So I pitched him and then he asked for the full on the call. So then I withdrew my query from Rose, sent it to Eric. 2 months later, he was like, hey, this is great. I don't think I'm the best person for it. I think there's a different agent at PS Lit who would really like it. Can I send it to them? I said, sure. He never actually said what agent he was sending it to. But like 3 weeks after he sent me, he like sent it to that other agent. I had the offer from Rose. And it turns out like we were talking, she had like bookmarked my query to request the full from anyway. And then I withdrew it from her. So it was just like a little roundabout path. So this is me saying just like cold querying works and it's not needed to like do all the extra stuff. I'm really lucky to have ended up with Rose because as soon as we got on the call, we just clicked. It was definitely a little bit of a nerve-wracking experience signing with her. I was actually Rose's first client, period. She had just joined PS Lit coming from like the editorial side. So she didn't have any other clients for me to talk to. It was just like the reputation of PS Lit as a whole, which is really good. And then like Rose's like personality and experience. And one of my other offers was from an agent with like multiple 6-figure deals at a very fancy agency. But it really came down to like her personality and like her belief and vision in the book more than anything else. And I have zero regrets about signing with her. I'm a huge fan. Rose, if you ever listen to this, I love you.
No, I really like that. I think that's good advice too for anyone who's querying and in the querying trenches, not just, holding steadfast and it is a waiting game, unfortunately, but also that being able to connect with your agent and finding someone who's like a true champion of your work is more important than I think anything, because they're going to be the ones who are like really in it with you on sub and making sure you get a good editor and represented by a good publisher. So that's amazing that you found someone who like you connect with personally so that they can really, take your book and do the best for it.
Yeah. And at some points, I actually think Rose had more faith in my book than I did. And she also put a lot of emphasis on like the debut experience, where if there was like an imprint where she didn't think that they would do the best to like set my career up for success, she always prioritized like saying no to like an offer like that and trying to either hold out for like a better debut experience or moving on to the next one, because she just wanted to set me up for my entire career as much as possible. She wasn't just focused on like getting the sale, clocking in, clocking out, like getting me off the books as like fast as possible. She wanted to make sure that like my career was going to be the best it possibly could. And I really, really respect her for doing that.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I mean, we all deserve to have, just like anyone in our life, like people in our life who are, looking out for us and just championing our work. Being an artist is such an interesting path because you are filled with so much self-doubt. It's like waves of self-doubt, and I'm the best. And so having someone who can like really champion your vision is really important. So on your digital footprint, you also stated, and I completely agree, that writing is not a solo sport, which I love. You have a really cute reel about it. And it's kind of showcased in how you're talking about your agent as well. But how do you think now, like, are you effectively building community with other writers? Do you have any advice for writers who are trying to find community themselves?
Yeah. So I know that like Twitter as a platform is like somewhat dying theoretically, but honestly, Twitter has been like a game changer for me in terms of finding other writing community, all of that. And for me, it's always been about like being very authentic in what I'm putting out there and trying to be positive, but not in a way that's like toxic positivity. Oh my God, I love every other writer, like rah, 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 cheerleading. But just trying to like if somebody's like posting a pitch, like taking the time to be like, oh my God, that genuinely sounds amazing. And also trying to offer as much help as I can, but not with the expectation that I'm going to get that back. I think a lot of people, especially when it comes to like finding beta readers, the best beta readers I found are people that I have beta read for first and then really loved their work and was able to have like a very effective conversation with them about their work. And then when it came time for me to like find people, they're already asking to beta. And then I'm getting like quality comments from them back because like I did it first. And you don't always get that. It's never a one-to-one reciprocity, but it's all about like what you're putting out there, I guess, because I am a big believer in like the energy that you put out is like the energy that you receive eventually in some form. And so just trying to like find other people that you can support and like trying to lift everybody else up because a rising tide lifts all ships and all that good stuff. Like even now, I have a very close group of writing friends that I'm so thankful for. And it is really important, especially like once you sign with an agent, it's a lot harder to find other agented authors who know what the unique hell of being on sub is. So I'm really grateful to have a lot of other authors that we signed around the same time, or we were querying at the same time, or they were agented first. And like, then a couple months later, I also signed. But it's also really hard to find those people, especially with like all of the drama around like Discord communities and like people being nasty. And so it does take some time and effort to like, I guess, like curate the people that you're around and like make sure that you are around people who have like good intentions as well. But I'm still always trying to like reach out a hand and help as many people as I can. Even like the formal processes, like I just signed up to be a mentor for the Right Team membership program, because I know how hard it is to like query and like everything. So I just want to help as many people as I possibly can. And I'm always trying to like promote everybody else's books and like make sure that they get the attention and eyes that they deserve. Cause like there are so many good books out there and incredible authors. I just want everyone to like get their due and make sure that they, I don't know, are getting the support that they need and deserve. So it's always about like, what can you do for other people, not just what they can do for you in terms of like building community. And I think that kind of mindset just goes so much further when you're authentic about it.
Yeah, I really love that. And it's so true with beta reading. You never know what you're going to get. So being able to cultivate um, that type of experience by just, like you said, like being the best beta reader that you can be can in turn help you find amazing beta readers, which is really great. And in general, like, do you have any advice for maybe writers who they've either like always wanted to write a book or they're struggling with their first draft and they just, need that kind of rah rah over the finish line? Like, do you have any advice for those people?
I think the best piece of advice I can give to those writers or literally anyone at any stage of your journey, stop punishing yourself because it hasn't happened yet. Comparison is the biggest thief of joy. It's so easy when you're at like 50K words and you know you need to write another 50K to look at somebody else who just signed a giant book deal and be like, well, they're better than me. They're like getting all of these things and I'm not. I can't even finish my draft. Like, just everybody has their own journey and their own pace at things. You shouldn't have to feel rushed that like all these people have just finished and they took less time than you, or like all these other like milestones and benchmarks that you can keep comparing yourself to. Like, I'll like in the moments that I feel bad that like I haven't had this like splashy thing happen or all these things, I have to remind myself like stop punishing myself because it hasn't happened. Because that is the worst thing you can do. You're just shooting yourself in your own foot by already feeling bad about something when you haven't even gotten to that point in your own personal journey. We're just comparing ourselves to other people at all the time. So there's always like, I don't know, there's those bits of self-doubt that I think hold people back from finishing or like putting themselves out there in terms of like querying or things like that, or being afraid to like move on to the next thing. Just, and I guess, keep your eyes on your own lane, ask for help if you need help, but you're going to get there. And so just keep chugging along, because all we can do as writers is keep writing. That's it.
Yeah, I love that. It's true. It's all we can do, sadly. Just keep writing. All you can do is keep writing. So I love that advice. I'd love to know what your career goals are for writing. Sky's the limit. It could be anything, any big dream that you have for your writing career.
Yeah, so in my ideal world, I am a blend of Olivia Blake and Katrina Ward. Probably two of my the authors that I look up to the most. I'll also throw R.F. Kuang in there as well. Of course, she's incredible. But what I admire the most about these authors is their ability to have such a strong authorial voice, but also branch out in terms of the genres that they're writing. So an Olivia Blake book, you open it up and it feels like an Olivia Blake book, but she could be writing dark academia, like contemporary fantasy, or she could be writing contemporary romance. But they both still feel like Olivia Blake books. So that is what I would love to have my career be, where someone can open up one of my books and be like, oh, this is a Rachel Kitch book, even though it might not be a true horror, commercial horror book. Because I have projects that are starting to lean more on the literary end of the spectrum. Some that's I don't even think it's a horror book necessarily. There's horror elements to it, but it's not a true horror. So I want to be able to branch out into other genres, but I always want it to feel like my kind of book. V.E. Schwab also does an amazing job with this, where you can open it up and be like, oh, that's a V.E. Schwab book. But I mean, she's written The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue compared to the Vicious trilogy. So those are the type of authors that I want to emulate, and I really, really admire.
I really do want to ask though about the bone jewelry, because I'm obsessed with the bone jewelry that you have in the photo right now on your website. And then you made a whole post about it on Instagram. I watched that a couple times of you putting it together. And for the viewers who are watching this on camera, I'll put a photo of it up on the screen of your amazing bone jewelry. But from that experience, you talked about how this kind of was a culmination of so many interests and passions that you have. And it seems like that is very evident in your books because there's so much happening. But how do you think all of these interests and passions have helped you be a better writer?
I personally think that being able to draw on so many different aspects of your life and different experiences and weird subject matters makes books feel so much more lived in, and it makes you feel like things are coming to life as opposed to someone wrote it down and it's telling it to you. I have always been just drawn to a bunch of different disparate things, and I get these mini obsessions about different subject matters. And so then I'll deep dive into it and learn it. And then I'll tuck away all of this knowledge. And then a sleeper agent, it'll come out and be applicable to the next thing I'm writing. It's always just been about what subject areas can I draw on. And sometimes I'll make connections that I had no idea would happen. But so that bone jewelry I made through 3D printing and 3D modeling, which I did a lot in grad school. But then it turns out bioengineering, which is something I'm just passionate about, they do a lot of 3D printing stuff. And so being able to draw on knowing a lot about the 3D printing process really helped write. And it's really funny because even before I ever thought about writing, before I even thought I was a horror author or anything like that, I remember like getting a tour of like the 3D printing studio, because I was like the studio administrator at Penn while I was there. And there's a lot of like chemicals that are used in the 3D printing process. One of which is lye, because it literally dissolves certain types of plastic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was like, whoa, I wonder if it could dissolve a human body. And that situation is going to happen in one of my books, because it can dissolve a human body. Very specific conditions. But so yeah, it's like all these like little like nuggets that I have tucked away just from like just genuinely being interested in like pursuing something, just kind of like for the love of it. And then it turns into these little like nuggets that I can farm later for my writing. And I feel like it really does make it come to life a lot more, because I just have so many weird life experiences I can be drawing on.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that relates to a lot of advice that I hear other authors talking about of like, if you need ideas or you're struggling for writing ideas, the best thing you can do is like, one, go outside, live, have experiences. Two, like find those things you're interested in, like let yourself run down the rabbit hole. And it seems like, you allow yourself to give in to all the interests and passions, which I think is so beautiful, because we're in a society that doesn't always necessarily encourage every interest and passion. They're kind of like, pick one thing and get really good at it and stick with it forever. So I love that, you have all these interests and passions, and it's like very evident in your work. And so that's really beautiful.
Yeah, refilling one's creative well is like the most important thing you can do as like an author. And a lot of times, like when like I get burnt out writing a lot of the time, because I'll like black out for 3 weeks and I'll have written like 20,000 words, like, and I need to like step away. Like finding other creative hobbies has been like the best way, because doing something completely else like lets your like neurons and synapses like rest, and then that's when those like new connections start like sparking up again. So it's all like, even especially when like publishing in general starts really like wearing you down, because it's so easy for querying or being on sub to like destroy your creative energy for like writing. Finding something else that you can do, and not something that you have to feel like you have to monetize or like necessarily even be really good at, is so important in making sure that like you are like rejuvenated creatively. That's a really gross word, rejuvenated, but like feeling better about like your creative energy and like where you're at.
It seems like also you have the creative interest in design. Obviously, you got your master's in design, but you also help authors design their own websites. I wanted to make sure we kind of had that plug in there for you, that, you are an available resource. But how has that process been? And like, how is that different, obviously, to these other creative paths that you're taking?
Yeah, so my day job is as a web designer. I work for a very large company, designing their like web mobile app experiences. But the thing is, like, I love my job, but you don't get to be very creative very often. And so working with authors and like building their websites has been sort of a culmination of all these different things that I'm interested in and I love doing, but also in a way that again refills my creative well and like lets me branch out and do a lot of different things. Websites is also something that like if you just like don't know much about, it's really overwhelming to try to figure out like how to build a website, and also how to make it look good and like clean and functional. It's never something I will tell people to go out and spend money on, especially because you can't like DIY it. But if you are especially like an indie author who wants to like sell direct off your website, or you just got like a new book deal and you want people to like subscribe to your newsletter and like build up your brand, those are instances where it could be a good use of like an investment to build up a really strong like author brand and author website. And so it just happened to be like, again, a mishmash of things that I am personally good at and love doing and have the connections to do nowadays. And not too many people in the like writing community know a lot about like web design. So it was never something I felt necessarily like guilty about charging money about. Like I would never, for example, like charge money to review a query letter. There's so many like free resources that are out there. I would never try to make money off of like selling my path to success or anything like that. Like, again, so many free resources. But it's like a very tangible like package and output that you get. And I'm like working with the authors like every step of the way. And it is like a good, I don't know, it's a good creative outlet for me that's not writing, still like writing focused. And it's just fun in general. So I try to like offer different price points for people, like depending on what they need. Cause like a lot of people don't need that much. Like I say this all the time on Twitter, like as an author, all you need is like a 1-page website that just says who you are, what your books are, and how to contact you. That's it. You don't need any like bells and whistles or anything like that. And so I'm always also happy to like point people in the directions of like tutorials online and like different resources if they like don't have that extra money, because like it's not cheap to like get a website up and running. So I'm just like trying to use like my expertise in like ways that I could really help authors.
Well, I have honestly loved talking to you. I think this has been very exciting for me. One, because as soon as I saw you posting about the forest bleeds on Instagram, I was like, I have to talk to Rachel. But I just love everything you said. I just feel like I really needed to hear that today, like just in my own creative journey. So it was just a really nice and lovely conversation. Like, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh my God, thank you so much for inviting me to come on. I love yapping in general. So this has been, again, so much fun. And thank you also for, everything that you do in trying to help writers like on their own journeys and everything, like all the resources that you're putting out on your YouTube channel. Like it's so important to do that. So thank you for everything that you've been doing.
Thank you. Well, I definitely want you to, let everyone know where to find you on the wide web so they can also look through your digital footprint and learn more about The Forest Bleeds when we get some more news.
Yeah, so everyone can find me on Twitter at Rachel Kitch, and then on TikTok and Instagram, I'm at Rach Kitch Writes. My website is also www.rachelkitchauthor.com. That is also where I have more information about my web design services, as well as my books and other ways that you can contact me. But in general, if anyone ever has questions about writing or journeys or querying or anything, my DMs are always open. I'm always more than happy to help in any way I can.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This was very, very fun. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Really. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap on episode 5 of Pen to Pod. Thank you so much for listening. I had such a blast talking to Rachel about her upcoming debut, The Forest Bleeds. Be sure to follow Rachel on her socials to find out more information about The Forest Bleeds and other works that she is writing. If you haven't already, please go ahead and follow this podcast wherever you are listening, whether that is Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. When you follow, you'll get notified when new episodes upload and you won't ever miss a day. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please feel free to leave a review. It helps so much with other writers like you finding where we are. It has been quite a journey creating this podcast, and I really, really loved it, alongside creating other writing content for you on my own YouTube channel at Mick Writes. Next week's episode will be another solo episode where I will be diving into a different aspect of writer voice, so be sure to tune in. And if you haven't listened to all the episodes yet, then what are you doing? Make sure you go catch up. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye, writers.